In this video, we're going to be talking about consent. So this video will be covering consent in under 16s. We'll talk about consent in general, and then we'll talk about Jehovah's Witnesses. So there's two types of frameworks used for children or under 16s. There's Gillick Competence and then there's Fraser Guidelines. Gillick Competence, typically they're used interchangeably, but for the sake of your interviews, we'll keep them to their specific definitions. Gillick Competence just refers to general competence in anybody under 16. So over 16, people are assumed to have capacity to consent. Under 16, you need to assess it. And Fraser Guidelines is used to assess competency to consent for contraceptives. And the Fraser Guidelines, so the contraceptives, I'll deal with in a separate video. So there's 4 things we need to discuss when dealing with consent. So 4 things that the patient has to fulfill to be able to say, for us to say that we think they have capacity. So the first thing is retaining information. So can they actually retain what's being said? If I say I'm speaking to somebody with advanced dementia, with severe memory loss, very unlikely they can retain the information. Next is, do they understand? So anything that's being explained, do they actually understand the information? Pros and cons. So whenever they're making a decision, can they weigh out the pros and cons of making this decision? For example, if it's a treatment for a pneumonia, so chest infection, and we're going to give them antibiotics, and the patient is refusing, do they actually understand the consequences of refusing this treatment? And do they understand the benefits of the treatment? And then lastly is, can they repeat the information back to you? For example, a patient with dementia, if I say something to them, explain the benefits of antibiotics for pneumonia, and I ask them, can you just repeat this information back to me? And they can't repeat it at all because they've got severe memory loss. In this case, they obviously don't have capacity to consent because they can't retain the information. Well, if they can't repeat the information, then they can't retain it. But obviously, in case of repeating information, we need to think about whether it's a physical problem or if it's a cognitive problem. So there's people who've had a stroke and they may not be able to vocalize the information. So there's different ways of assessing capacity. You can say if the patient is incapacitated but they can blink, you can say if you understand the information, blink twice. If you don't understand, blink once. The person might not have the ability to speak because of a stroke, but they may be able to write, so they can repeat the information back in written form as opposed to verbally. So it's quite basic, but in real life it can be quite nuanced depending on what it is that you're dealing with. But for your interviews, you just need to understand these 4 principles. And you might be saying, okay, well, how do I know that they understand the information? Well, put all 4 together, because they have to meet all 4 of these criteria for them to have capacity. It can't just be a single one. Now, if they can retain it, they can weigh out the pros and cons, and they can repeat it back to you, it's very unlikely that they don't understand. So it's more holistic rather than looking at just one individual thing. Now, capacity is time and place dependent, meaning at the time that you've assessed for capacity, and let's say you're seeking consent for treatment, they may say yes at that time, but maybe in 2 days' time, they may not have capacity. So unless you have reason to assume, again, anybody over the age of 16, they assume to have capacity, but otherwise, if you have a reason to suspect they don't have capacity, like either they're under 16 or they have some condition like dementia, for example, then you need to reassess capacity. So let's say somebody with dementia, they may have fluctuating confusion, because some types of dementia, there's a type called Lewy bodies. Lewy body dementia typically presents with fluctuating confusion. So some days they're okay, some days they're not. So at the time that you're speaking to them, they may have the ability to understand what you're saying and be able to consent for treatment or refuse treatment. 2 days later, they may have a acute episode of, their confusion, and now they can't consent. So there's fluctuating capacity. Or you might have somebody who, they don't have any cognitive problems, but they might be unconscious at the time that you're dealing with them. It might be somebody who's got some kind of psychiatric problem, so they're having an acute psychotic episode, and they're completely out of touch with the reality. It might be somebody who's intoxicated. So of course, at the time of intoxication, if they're high on drugs, if they're drunk, they probably won't be able to consent in that situation. I say probably because intoxicated, it doesn't necessarily always affect your cognition. You might have paracetamol overdose, so you're intoxicated paracetamol, but you might still have capacity. So talking intoxication in the sense that if it's something that actually would affect your cognition. Okay. Now, we can also think about the fact that sometimes you can consent for some things and maybe not other things. So for example, you might have somebody who has, actually an easier example would be somebody again with, let's go with this psychotic episode. So let's say the patient is psychotic. Now, and they also have a chest infection. So they have a pneumonia, but they've also got psychosis. Now, the psychotic episode could be something like, imagine if I start saying I'm the King of England. I'm the King of England and I have a meeting with the Prime Minister tomorrow. I also, I ride massive dragons and I have a battle upcoming tomorrow as well, which is why I need to speak with the Prime Minister before I go to war. Something crazy. If the psychiatrist challenges me on this and I say no, this is all real, I'm not making this up. Obviously, as far as my psychosis is concerned, I don't have capacity. So I can't, as far as consent to capacity goes, I don't obviously have that with regards to my psychosis. However, I might have a pneumonia. In the case of the pneumonia, they might say to me, you have a chest infection and you need, your antibiotics, your fluids, whatever, because we need to treat you. Otherwise, you'll die from it. And even though I'm in a psychotic state, I understand the pros and cons of the treatment for the pneumonia in and of itself, so I can consent to that. Okay, so this is what I mean when I say capacity can be quite nuanced, because you can have one patient who's completely unable to consent for one thing, but they have no problem giving consent for something else. Okay. So, some of the things to bear in mind. If someone is unable to consent, just some things to factor in. So, can we wait until, is it safe to wait until they have regained capacity. So is it safe to wait until they regained capacity? So let's say they've lost consciousness for whatever reason, but we think that hopefully with treatment they'll be back within the next couple of hours. But they're prior to that they weren't really eating and drinking properly. So we can say, if you're not eating and drinking properly, obviously you're going to become malnourished. But a few hours, unless it's like severe malnourishment, a few hours is probably not going to kill them. So can we just wait until they regain capacity, and then we'll think about options to give more invasive forms of feeding. So if they're not wanting to take food in by mouth, we could give them a tube. So a tube go through the nose, through the mouth, or through the stomach. You don't need to go into that kind of detail in your interview, but just have that appreciation that can we just wait until they have regained regain capacity at a later time. And then identify their views and wishes which they've held previously. So let's say somebody who gets cancer, or somebody says before they got dementia, if I have a cancer I would never want to be treated, and maybe they've written that somewhere. They said, I don't want to put my family through all this. I understand that if I don't get treated I'll die, etc. So they show at the time they understand the pros and cons of being treated for cancer, but then they get dementia. If you find that later, when they have the dementia, if you find they've written this, and let's say the dementia is so bad that they just can't, you're not expecting them to have capacity at any point in the future, then you can go off that. Also discuss it with the next of kin. So next of kin would be someone who, if the person doesn't have capacity, then who's the closest person to them that we can discuss the situation with. So usually it'll be like a family member. Now let's talk about Gillick Competence. So Gillick Competence is just assessing capacity in under 16s for any decision making. So there's 3 things to know. Under 16, you need to assess capacity. If they're between the ages of 16 and 18, so anybody who's 16 and over is assumed to have capacity. So and 18 and over, they can consent plus refuse treatment. So in someone who's 18 and over, when I say about this refusal of treatment, it simply means if they have capacity, they can consent to treatment, and they can also refuse treatment, even if the treatment could cause and could have severe consequences like end of life. For example, refusing cancer treatment, which if they don't get treated, they'll die of the cancer. Because at 18 you're considered legally an adult, so you can make your own decisions like this. Under 16, you need to assess capacity. So it goes back to those 4 principles of, can they retain information, can they understand information, can they weigh out the pros and cons, and can they repeat this information. If they meet those 4 criteria, then they're assumed to have capacity, so they can consent to treatment. But if they refuse, then can be treated against their wishes. bad handwriting. So under 16s, assess their capacity, they can consent to the treatment, but if they refuse, they can be treated against their wishes. 16 and 18, unless you have reason to suspect that they don't have capacity, then they assume that they have capacity. However, if they also refuse to be treatment, then they can be treated against their wishes. In this case, if they have capacity but they're refusing treatment, can be a bit of a just a tricky situation. The ideal is to speak to the parents. So parents can, if any child under the age of 18, the parents can overrule their decision to refuse treatment. And if the parents are in agreement with the child and they too are refusing for the child to have the treatment, such as for example Jehovah's Witnesses, which we'll discuss later, then you can seek a court order. So the Court of Protection, they can look into the case and they can overrule the decision if it's deemed in the child's best interest. In certain circumstances, for example, if the child is, let's say it's a 17-year-old that's been stabbed and they've got a potentially fatal wound, so they're bleeding out and they need blood, or they need some treatment that will save their life. If they're refusing, and for whatever reason the parents are refusing as well, if it's deemed that by the time you get a court order ruling that the patient will probably die before you can get that ruling, then you can treat them there and then as an emergency treatment in their best interest. Because in this case, you have a defense if you get taken to court, because you can say, had I waited for a court order, they would have died. And according to what I think is in their best interest, if I didn't give that treatment, they would have died. So in such a situation, it's very unlikely that the court order would say it's fine, they don't need the treatment. Very unlikely the court order would go against the intention to save life. Now let's talk about Jehovah's Witnesses. Jehovah's Witnesses are simply a particular sect of Christians that refuse to have blood products because it's against their religious beliefs. The same rules apply for, as you would in normal, for the Gillick Competence. So if they're under the age of 18 and let's say they refuse and they have capacity, you can't treat them against their wishes, because there's been lengthy discussion over the many decades, and one thing that was said was somebody under the age of 18, they don't necessarily have enough life experience to be able to rationalize the weight of life and death decisions. And there was a famous saying that the parents, should they wish, they can be martyrs for their faith, but under the same circumstances they can't make martyrs of their children. They shouldn't be free to make that decision. Okay, so under the age of 18 they can refuse. So let's say they have capacity, they refuse, can treat against their wishes. Again, if it's an emergency, then you may not have time to seek a court order protection ruling, so you can treat them. If there's time, for example, let's say a patient just has anemia because of some genetic disease, but they're not necessarily going to die imminently, it's more a case of just helping them with symptom relief, then you can seek, then you should seek a court order ruling. If somebody, however, is over the age of 18, then of course they can refuse. if they have capacity. If, for example, if somebody needs blood, but let's say they're unconscious, check for, so JW just means Jehovah Witness. So check for a Jehovah Witness bracelet or a card. They might have it in their pocket, you know, around their wrist or something, just to say that there's somebody that they can't have blood. So many different types of illnesses, people can carry certain indicators. So if they become acutely unwell, they might lose consciousness. It's helpful for medical staff or just people in the public, just to know that, you know, this bracelet indicates that they have this disease. And because they might have some, for example, an EpiPen that they carry in their pocket, EpiPen for people who might have an anaphylactic reaction to something. If the public see that they're wearing that bracelet, they'll have that awareness that maybe they've got some medication in their pocket that we can give to them in the event that for whatever reason the patient can't give that treatment to themselves. So always check these things before giving it. If, let's say, somebody they're not conscious, they need the blood urgently, and they're going to die without it, a family member might say, but the family might be Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, unless you have solid evidence that that patient is a Jehovah's Witness, then you should still give them the blood product. Because if they die, and then it turns out they weren't a Jehovah's Witness, then that's going to be difficult to defend in court. But if you get taken to court anyway, and you know there was no substantial evidence to say there's a Jehovah's Witness, then there was no, you know, it'll be in your favor. Because why wouldn't you treat someone who, if a family member says a Jehovah's Witness, but you have no records to show that they were Jehovah's Witness, and there's no evidence on that patient, like they're not wearing a bracelet or a card, or they're not carrying a card to say that they're Jehovah's Witness, and had you not given them that treatment, then of course it's a life and death situation. Okay. So this covers most of the consent. There's one other thing, which is lasting power of attorney. This is something that is essentially a contract that stipulates if patient loses capacity, someone else can make decisions for them. So the person who can make those decisions would be that patient's lasting power of attorney. It's not necessarily always medical. There's decisions regarding person's medical problems, and there's the other side, which is financial. So that would be things like, you know, your housing. What will happen to your house in the event that you lose capacity? Maybe the patient needs to be put in a care home. You know, they can't stay in, it's not safe for them to stay in the house. Any other financial, you know, like mortgage, rent, bills, things like that. The condition is LPA must be, so the LPA form must be signed whilst the patient has capacity. It cannot be done after the patient has lost capacity. So let's say a patient has got a new diagnosis of dementia. So they have some short-term memory problems, but generally they're okay. They can assign a lasting power of attorney because they know long-term they're going to completely lose their ability to make decisions. They can assign it to one of their children, for example. However, if they didn't have capacity, then they can't then put the LPA in. So it must be done whilst the patient has capacity. So the LPA can be overruled if the patient has capacity. So during the time that the patient has capacity, they can retract it and, say that this person doesn't have the LPA over me anymore. However, if they've lost their capacity, then obviously they can't make those decisions anymore. There's also advanced decisions. So advanced decisions is basically like a will. So it's a plan of what, once you've lost capacity, or should you lose capacity in the future, what treatment wouldn't you want? So obviously you can't consent for treatment once in the future, or you can consent to it, but obviously consent is time, place specific. So what you can do is you can refuse treatment. You can never demand treatment, but you can always refuse it if you have capacity. So in this case, as advanced decision is about refusing treatment. So, and what your preferences would be later on in life should you lose capacity. This will only take place once capacity is lost. So same thing with the LPA. So LPA only takes place once the capacity is lost. And the LPA and the advanced decision making, they're both legally binding, but only once the patient has lost capacity, because only then do they are they taken into account. And all that means is whatever rules were made within that contract when it was signed, once it takes effect, i.e. when the patient loses capacity, if any of those rules are breached, then the party can be taken to court, whoever breached the rules.